The American Civil War officially ended in 1865, but in some places, people say it never really left. Across the United States, former battlefields still produce strange stories. Visitors report footsteps in empty fields. Park rangers hear distant drumming. And every so often, someone claims they've seen a soldier standing where no one should be. Now, are these ghost stories, historical echoes, or just what happens when history gets a little too close for comfort? Today, we're diving into the strangest, weirdest, and occasionally eerie facts from the Civil War, from exploding bullets and wandering camels to the battlefields that some people swear are still crowded. Let's step back in time, and maybe not entirely alone. When the war refused to end. Imagine fighting a war so brutal, people claimed it never actually ended. Not politically, not emotionally, and according to thousands of witnesses, not even spiritually. The American Civil War officially ended in 1865, but for many Americans, especially those living near battlefields, the aftermath didn't feel like peace. It felt crowded. More than 750,000 soldiers died during the war. That's more American deaths than World War I and World War II combined. And here's the strange part. Many of those soldiers were buried quickly, sometimes in shallow graves, sometimes in mass graves, sometimes not buried at all for days. Battlefields like Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh became vast, silent landscapes, filled with stories that refused to stay buried. Locals began reporting odd experiences almost immediately after the war ended. Farmers claimed they heard marching at night. Travelers reported phantom campfires. Families living near former battlefields described doors opening on their own and footsteps in empty rooms. At first, people assumed it was grief, trauma, or imagination, but the stories didn't fade, they multiplied. By the late 1800s, Gettysburg had already developed a reputation as one of the most haunted places in America. Visitors claimed they saw soldiers walking across fields that were completely empty. Others reported hearing cannon fire echoing across the hills, despite no one firing anything. Even today, park rangers and tourists report strange sounds, shadowy figures, and the feeling of being watched. Now, whether you believe in ghosts or not, one thing is certain. The Civil War left scars so deep, they didn't just shape American history, they shaped American folklore. Because when a war claims hundreds of thousands of lives, the stories don't end with the last battle. Sometimes, they just change form. The strangest Civil War facts that sound fake, but aren't. The Civil War was tragic. It was brutal. It was chaotic. But it was also incredibly weird. Because when a nation goes to war at full scale for the first time, strange things happen. Desperate things. Sometimes even absurd things. For example, let's talk about teeth. During the Civil War, soldiers needed bullets. Lots of bullets. And those bullets required gunpowder cartridges that had to be torn open with your teeth. So what happened when soldiers didn't have enough teeth? Dentures. Yes, really. Dentures became so valuable during the Civil War that some were made from the teeth of fallen soldiers. Battlefields occasionally doubled as extremely grim dental supply stores. This sounds like an urban legend, but period records show that human teeth were commonly used in dentures throughout the 1800s, and wartime increased demand dramatically. So somewhere out there, it's entirely possible a soldier marched into battle using someone else's smile. And that's just the beginning. The Civil War also saw the first large-scale use of hot air balloons for military spying. Both sides used balloonists to float high above battlefields and observe enemy movements. From the ground, it must have looked surreal, a giant balloon drifting silently over cannon fire and marching troops. Imagine being a soldier in 1862. You're exhausted. You haven't slept properly in days. You look up, and there's a man in a basket floating in the sky, taking notes. War had officially entered the era of strange technology. And then there were the camels. Before the Civil War began, the U.S. Army experimented with using camels in the American Southwest. Yes, Camels. The idea was that camels could carry heavy supplies across desert terrain better than horses, and technically, they worked. But once the Civil War started, the camel experiment fell apart. Some camels were sold off, others escaped. A few reportedly wandered the American landscape for years afterward, which means that in the late 1800s, there were occasional reports of wild camels roaming parts of the United States. Imagine being a farmer in Texas in 1870 and seeing a camel walk past your property. You'd probably assume you were hallucinating. And honestly, you wouldn't be the only one. But perhaps the strangest Civil War reality wasn't dentures, or balloons, or wandering camels. It was the sheer scale of improvisation. This was one of the first modern wars. Medicine was still developing, communication was slow, and both sides constantly invented solutions on the fly. Some worked, some definitely did not, but all of them created stories that sound almost fictional today. Because history isn't just made of dates and battles, it's made of human moments, strange decisions, unexpected inventions, and sometimes unbelievably weird details that somehow turned out to be true. Lincoln, premonitions, and the ghost in the White House. The Civil War didn't just haunt battlefields. Some say it followed one man in particular, President Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln led the United States through its most devastating conflict. He carried the weight of the war daily, casualty reports, battlefield decisions, and a divided nation resting on his shoulders. And according to those closest to him, he had an uneasy relationship with the supernatural long before his death. In the final days of the Civil War, Lincoln reportedly told a small group of friends about a dream. In the dream, he wandered through the White House. Everything was quiet, unusually quiet. He walked from room to room until he reached the East Room. There he saw a casket. Guards stood nearby. Mourners gathered around. Lincoln approached one of the soldiers and asked, "Who is dead in the White House?" The soldier replied, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." Lincoln then woke up. Days later, on April 14, 1865, he was assassinated at Ford's Theater. Now, dreams are strange things. People have unsettling dreams all the time. But this particular story was repeated by multiple individuals who claimed Lincoln told it shortly before his death. Whether coincidence, embellishment, or something more, the story quickly became part of American folklore. And then came the sightings. After Lincoln's death, reports began surfacing that his presence lingered in the White House. First Lady Grace Coolidge claimed she saw Lincoln standing at a window in the Yellow Oval Room, looking out toward the Potomac River. Staff members during different administrations reported footsteps in hallways. Some said they felt a presence in certain rooms late at night. One of the most famous stories involves British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. According to accounts, Churchill was staying at the White House during World War II. One night, after a bath, he walked into his bedroom, only to see Lincoln standing near the fireplace. Churchill reportedly paused, looked at the figure, and calmly said something along the lines of, "Good evening, Mr. President. You seem to have me at a disadvantage." Then, depending on the version of the story, he either left the room or simply chose to sleep somewhere else that night. Over the decades, White House staff, guests, and presidents have shared similar experiences. Some describe hearing footsteps. Others claim doors open and close. A few insist they've seen Lincoln himself, usually near windows or hallways. Now, skeptics point out something important. The White House is one of the most emotionally charged buildings in the country. It has witnessed war decisions, national tragedies, and enormous pressure. It's not surprising that people might feel a strong atmosphere there. But Lincoln's story remains unique, because his presidency was defined by the Civil War. His life ended just days after its conclusion, and his legacy became inseparable from the nation's memory of that conflict. So whether the sightings are ghostly encounters, powerful imagination, or simply stories passed down through generations, one thing is certain. The Civil War didn't just shape battlefields and borders. It left an imprint on the very places where history was decided. And if legends are to be believed, one of its most important figures may have never fully left the building. Gettysburg Today, the battlefield that still feels crowded. If one place has become the center of Civil War ghost lore, it's Gettysburg. More than 50,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing here in just 3 days. The battle was massive, chaotic, and devastating. When it ended in July of 1863, the landscape was left scarred. Fields were torn apart, homes were turned into hospitals, and for weeks the air reportedly carried the smell of smoke and loss. Today, Gettysburg is peaceful. Rolling hills, quiet fields, wooden fences, tourists taking photos in the sun. But many visitors say that once evening arrives, the atmosphere changes. Park rangers have shared stories for decades. Not official statements, of course, more like quiet conversations after tours. Some say they've heard footsteps behind them while walking empty trails. Others report the sound of distant drumming. Occasionally, people claim they hear what sounds like cannon fire, even though nothing is there. Then there are the sightings. Visitors have reported seeing figures in uniform standing along tree lines. Sometimes they appear solid, other times, not quite. One of the most famous modern stories involves a group of visitors driving through the battlefield at night. According to their account, they saw several men in what looked like Civil War uniforms standing near a fence. The men appeared confused. One even approached the car. Thinking they were reenactors, the visitors offered them snacks. But the figures didn't respond normally. They just stared, then slowly walked away into the darkness. When the visitors later asked a park ranger about reenactments in that area that night, there weren't any. Now, could this be misidentification? Of course. Lighting plays tricks. People get turned around. Our brains fill in gaps. But what makes Gettysburg interesting is consistency. Stories from the 1800s sound surprisingly similar to stories from today. Footsteps, marching, figures in the distance, the feeling of being watched. Even skeptics admit something about Gettysburg feels heavy. Not in a frightening way, more like standing in a place where something important happened. Because something did. Gettysburg isn't just a battlefield. It's a place where thousands of lives intersected in a single moment of history. And when people visit locations like that, they often report a strong emotional reaction. Some call it atmosphere, some call it memory, and some call it something else entirely. But whether you believe in ghosts or not, Gettysburg has become a place where history feels unusually close. Close enough that sometimes people swear they're not alone out there, even when the fields look completely empty. Strange aftermath. When the war left things behind. Wars don't end neatly. They leave things behind. Sometimes it's monuments, sometimes it's memories, and sometimes it's objects that refuse to stay in the past. After the Civil War ended, the United States faced a massive task, recovering bodies, rebuilding towns, and trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the scale of the conflict created strange situations. For years after major battles, farmers plowing their fields continued to uncover artifacts. Buttons, bullets, pieces of uniforms, even entire weapons buried just beneath the soil. In some areas near former battlefields, it wasn't unusual to find a musket ball while planting crops. Imagine working your land and casually pulling a piece of history out of the ground. Every season. And then there were the trees. Certain trees that stood during major battles absorbed bullets and shrapnel. Over time, the bark grew around the metal. Decades later, people cutting lumber occasionally discovered bullets embedded inside tree trunks. Some of these bullet trees still exist today, living witnesses to battles that happened more than 150 years ago. But perhaps the strangest aftermath involved the movement of bodies. After the war, many soldiers were buried quickly in temporary graves. Later, large efforts were made to relocate them into national cemeteries. This meant that years after the war ended, workers were still recovering remains from battlefields. Some accounts describe laborers who refused to work after sunset, not because of danger, but because of the atmosphere. They reported hearing strange sounds, feeling watched, or simply feeling an overwhelming sense of unease once the light faded. Again, skeptics point out the obvious. Working on a battlefield filled with loss would affect anyone emotionally. But even setting the paranormal aside, the physical remnants of the war created surreal moments. There are documented cases of unexploded artillery shells being discovered decades later. Occasionally, construction crews in former battle zones still uncover them today. Imagine building a road and finding a live shell from the 1860s. It's a reminder that history isn't always buried as deeply as we think. Even photographs from the late 1800s show battlefields still scattered with debris years after the fighting stopped. The war may have officially ended in 1865, but in many places the cleanup lasted generations. And in some ways, it still hasn't fully ended. Because every so often someone digs in the right place, and the past quite literally resurfaces. A button, a bullet, a fragment of a story. Proof that the Civil War didn't just shape history books. It left physical traces behind, hidden in fields, forests, and towns, waiting quietly to be rediscovered. Why the ghost stories never disappeared. By now you might be wondering, why are there so many ghost stories connected to the Civil War? Other wars were deadlier worldwide. Other places have seen unimaginable loss. And yet, in the United States, Civil War battlefields have become some of the most famously haunted locations in the country. So what's going on? Part of the answer is timing. The Civil War happened during a period when spiritualism was incredibly popular in America. Seances, spirit photography, and communication with the dead weren't fringe interests, they were mainstream. Families who lost loved ones often turned to mediums in hopes of hearing from them again. When so many soldiers died far from home, without proper burial or goodbye, the idea that their spirits lingered became a powerful cultural narrative. In other words, Americans in the 1860s were already primed to interpret strange experiences as supernatural ones. Then there's the scale. The Civil War caused massive loss in a relatively short period of time. Entire communities were affected. Nearly everyone knew someone who had been killed or wounded. When people visited battlefields after the war, they weren't just visiting historical sites. They were visiting places tied directly to personal grief. That emotional weight can change how a place feels. Modern psychology suggests that environments associated with tragedy can heighten our senses. We become more alert, more aware of sounds, more sensitive to movement and atmosphere. So when someone walks through a quiet battlefield at dusk, their brain is already in a heightened state. A distant noise becomes more noticeable. A shadow seems more significant. The wind moving through grass sounds almost like footsteps. But here's where things get interesting. Even people who don't believe in ghosts often describe similar experiences in these places. A feeling of heaviness, a sense of presence, the impression that the location holds memory. And in a way, it does. Battlefields are physical spaces where thousands of intense human experiences occurred simultaneously. Fear, courage, pain, hope. When you stand in a place like Gettysburg, you're standing where history happened in real time. Not in a book, not on a screen, right there. So it's not surprising that people feel something. Now, does that mean the ghost stories are true? That depends on who you ask. Some people are convinced they've seen things they can't explain. Others believe the stories are powerful folklore shaped by grief and memory. And many simply enjoy the mystery, because whether you believe in ghosts or not, these stories serve a purpose. They keep history alive. They remind us that real people stood in these places, that real lives were lived and lost here. And sometimes, the best way humans process overwhelming events is through storytelling. Stories of echoes, stories of lingering footsteps, stories that suggest the past isn't entirely gone, even if what we're really sensing is the weight of history itself. Final chapter. when history feels close enough to touch. The Civil War ended more than 150 years ago. The soldiers are gone, the cannons are silent, the smoke has long since cleared. And yet, the stories remain. Some are strange but true. Dentures made from battlefield teeth, camels wandering the American Southwest, bullets still hidden inside trees. Some are emotional. Families searching for closure, communities rebuilding after unimaginable loss. And some are just a little eerie. Footsteps in empty fields, figures seen at dusk. The sense that certain places feel crowded, even when they're not. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the Civil War left behind something powerful. Not just monuments, not just documents, but atmosphere. Because when enough history happens in one place, people don't just remember it, they feel it. Battlefields like Gettysburg aren't theme parks, they're time capsules. You walk across grass that witnessed moments of fear, courage, confusion, and survival. And sometimes, when the wind moves just right across an open field, it's easy to imagine echoes. Not literal ghosts necessarily, but echoes of footsteps, echoes of voices, echoes of a nation trying to figure itself out in real time. History has a strange way of staying close to us. Sometimes it's in museums, sometimes in letters and photographs, and sometimes it's in places where the past feels just a little more present than usual. So if you ever visit a Civil War battlefield, take a moment. Stand still. Listen to the wind. Look across the landscape. You might not see anything unusual, but you might feel something. And that feeling, that sense of standing where history actually happened, is one of the closest things we have to time travel. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy strange history, forgotten stories, and the occasional historical mystery, make sure to subscribe for more episodes in this series. Because history isn't just what happened, it's what lingers, what fascinates us, and sometimes what refuses to completely fade away. I'll see you in the next story.